The first time the name Nick Reiner appeared in headlines, it felt unreal, like a sentence written wrong on purpose to shock the reader into stopping. A quiet Los Angeles morning was suddenly split open by a story no one wanted to believe, that a son had been taken into custody for the deaths of his own parents inside the very home meant to protect him. There was no dramatic chase, no public meltdown, no footage of chaos. Instead, there was silence, thick and unsettling, followed by a photograph of a young man sitting calmly, almost blankly, as if the weight of what was being said had not yet reached him. People waited for denial, for rage, for tears, for anything that fit the image they had in their minds of someone accused of something so unthinkable. What they got instead was stillness. Nick did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He looked past the questions, past the room, as though he were already somewhere else, locked inside a place no one could reach. 2 weeks later, in a cold interrogation room washed in fluorescent light, the story took its first sharp turn. When investigators laid out the crime scene photographs, the calm finally shattered. Nick's body folded inward, and the sound that came out of him was not anger, but something rawer, deeper, a kind of grief that did not seem rehearsed or performative. It filled the room, and then collapsed into heavy silence. From that moment, the narrative shifted. This was no longer just a crime story. It was the beginning of a slow, painful unraveling of a life shaped by loneliness, addiction, expectation, and a silence that had been building for decades. This tragedy did not begin on the night his parents died. It began years earlier, in moments so small they would have been easy to miss. A child sitting in the same room as his family, hearing laughter, watching conversations flow around him, but never quite finding the right moment to step in. There were no obvious villains in those early years, no screaming matches, no visible cruelty. What existed instead was distance. Emotional distance that does not leave bruises but settles quietly into the mind, teaching a child to question their own worth. As Nick grew older, that distance hardened into a belief that he was somehow incomplete, a version of himself that could never measure up to the family name he carried. By the time addiction entered his life, it did not arrive as rebellion or defiance. It arrived as relief. Drugs quieted the noise in his head, softened the constant comparison, and offered a brief escape from the pressure to be someone he did not know how to become. What started as an attempt to cope quickly turned into a cycle that consumed him. Rehab, recovery, relapse, and disappointment repeated over and over, each time carving the disappointment deeper into everyone involved. His parents did not turn away. They spent years trying to pull him back, spending time, energy, and hope, believing that love and persistence would eventually be enough. Nick's later words would haunt those who heard them. He admitted that his parents never abandoned him, that they kept reaching out even when he disappeared, even when the phone calls went unanswered. The emptiness, he said, came from abandoning himself. That admission complicates everything. It strips away any easy explanation and replaces it with something far more uncomfortable. Love existed in that house, real and unwavering, but it lived alongside fear, exhaustion, and the constant dread of waiting for the next relapse. When Nick returned home months before the tragedy, it was not a return filled with relief. It was a return marked by tension, sleepless nights, and the quiet terror of a family that knew how fragile things had become. Conversations faded before they reached resolution. Promises of starting over sounded hopeful and hollow at the same time. Fear crept into every interaction, shaping how love was expressed and how silence was interpreted. By the time the night of the holiday party arrived, everything that followed felt less like a sudden explosion and more like the final crack in something that had been breaking for years. The confession that would later leave so many people speechless did not come out as a clean admission. It came in fragments, through trembling sentences and long pauses, through memories of a mind overwhelmed by noise and pressure. Nick did not describe himself as a monster. He described himself as someone who wanted the pain to stop and did not understand when or how that desire twisted into something irreversible. What followed would force the public to confront a question that has no easy answer: whether this was the story of a calculated act of violence or the devastating end of a long, untreated collapse that everyone saw but no one knew how to stop. Do you want me to continue with the next part of the story? Long before the headlines reduced his life to a single name and a single act, Nick Reiner existed inside a complicated family world that was both supportive and quietly suffocating. To understand how the story moved toward tragedy, it is necessary to step back into the years when nothing seemed overtly wrong, when the danger lived not in chaos but in calm routines and unspoken expectations. Nick grew up surrounded by stability, structure, and a family legacy that loomed larger with each passing year. From the outside, it looked like privilege. From the inside, it felt like pressure without instructions. As a child, Nick was not disruptive or openly troubled. He was observant, quiet, often retreating into himself rather than demanding attention. He watched how easily connection flowed between other members of his family, how conversations sparked and laughter followed without effort. He noticed how his siblings bonded with their father through shared interests, through work, through moments that felt natural to everyone else. Nick, by contrast, felt like an observer inside his own home, present but not anchored. There was no locked door keeping him out. The door was open, yet he never felt he knew how to walk through it. This emotional gap did not announce itself as pain at first. It appeared as confusion. Nick could not understand why he fell out of place when nothing was obviously wrong. His parents were not cruel. They were attentive in practical ways, invested in his safety, his future, his survival. But emotional connection is not built on intention alone. It grows through resonance, through shared language, through feeling seen without having to explain yourself. For Nick, that resonance never quite arrived. Instead, he internalized the absence, slowly turning it inward as self-doubt. As he entered his teenage years, that doubt hardened into a belief that something inside him was defective. The weight of his family name did not inspire him. It intimidated him. The achievements, the reputation, the expectations felt like a standard he could not meet and did not know how to challenge. While others saw opportunity, Nick felt comparison. While others felt pride, he felt exposure. Every success around him became a mirror reflecting what he believed he lacked. It was during this period that substances entered his life, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of relief. Drugs did not make him feel powerful. They made him feel quiet. They softened the relentless inner dialogue and temporarily erased the feeling of being measured against something unreachable. For the first time, Nick experienced moments where the noise stopped. That relief came at a cost he did not yet understand. What soothed him at first soon began to control him, tightening its grip each time he tried to let go. His parents noticed the change quickly. They did not deny it or minimize it. They intervened, sending him to rehab while he was still young, believing early action could redirect his path. Those early interventions were not acts of rejection. They were acts of hope. Each attempt at recovery carried the same fragile belief that this time would be different, that clarity would last, that Nick would find his footing. And for brief periods, it seemed possible. He would return home calmer, focused, promising himself and his family that he was ready to start again. But addiction does not erase emotional wounds. It exposes them. Each relapse came with heavier shame, deeper disappointment, and a growing sense that he was failing not just himself, but everyone who refused to give up on him. Nick became trapped between gratitude and guilt. He knew his parents were trying. He knew they loved him. Yet that knowledge did not heal the emptiness he carried. Instead, it intensified the pressure. The more they hoped, the more terrified he became of letting them down again. Over time, the relationship between Nick and his parents subtly shifted. Love remained, but it was joined by vigilance. Conversations became careful. Silences became loaded. Every unanswered call carried fear. Every answered call carried relief mixed with dread. Nick could feel this change even when no one said it out loud. He interpreted concern as judgment, worry as expectation. His parents, in turn, struggled to balance support with boundaries, never quite knowing when helping became enabling or when distance became abandonment. As the years passed, Nick drifted from place to place, trying to outrun both his addiction and his identity. Geography offered distraction, but no solution. Each new city promised anonymity, freedom from the weight of his family name, a chance to exist without explanation. But the same patterns followed him. Isolation deepened. Substance use escalated. Recovery became shorter, relapses longer. With every cycle, hope returned more cautiously, as if everyone involved had learned that believing too strongly only made the fall more painful. When Nick eventually returned home again, it was not a triumphant return. It was a retreat. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically, worn down by years of fighting himself. His parents welcomed him, but the house no longer felt safe in the way it once had. The tension was subtle but constant. Sleepless nights replaced quiet ones. Fear hovered beneath routine conversations. Nick sensed it and resented it, even as he understood where it came from. He wanted to be trusted, but he no longer trusted himself. This unresolved dynamic became the emotional backdrop to everything that followed. Years of unmet connection, addiction, recovery, disappointment, and love layered on top of one another until the weight became unbearable. By the time the family reached the final months before the tragedy, they were no longer simply living together. They were surviving alongside one another, each hoping for peace, each afraid of what might come next. And in that fragile space, with no clear villain and no clear solution, the stage was quietly set for a collapse that would shock the world. Do you want me to continue with the next part of the story? The weeks leading up to the tragedy felt deceptively ordinary on the surface, but beneath that thin layer of routine, something was quietly unraveling. Nick's return to his parents' home was framed as a pause, a chance to rest, to regain stability after years of drifting. He told them he needed quiet, time, space to breathe. His parents agreed, not because they believed everything was suddenly fine, but because they had learned that pushing too hard could shatter what little balance existed. The house settled into an uneasy rhythm where everyone moved carefully, as if one wrong step might trigger something none of them could control. Nick spent his days drifting through the rooms, sleeping late, skipping meals, staring at nothing for long stretches of time. He talked about finding work, about starting over, about putting his life back together, and sometimes his voice carried enough conviction to sound believable. His mother listened without interrupting, afraid that probing too deeply would make him retreat again. His father tried to maintain structure, clinging to routines that once anchored the household. But both of them sensed the same thing. The calm was fragile. It felt borrowed, temporary, like silence before a storm that never fully passed. The relapses came quietly, not with dramatic scenes or confrontations, but with subtle shifts in mood and behavior. Nick became more irritable, more withdrawn, snapping at small comments, bristling at concern. Sleepless nights returned. His mother stayed awake, listening for movement, for doors opening, for any sound that might signal danger. His father noticed the tension tightening in his son's jaw, the way his eyes darted when he felt watched. Fear lived in the house now, unspoken but undeniable. Nick could feel it too, and it fed his resentment. Being seen as fragile felt like being accused. Being protected felt like being judged. Conversations began to fade before they reached resolution. Questions hung in the air, unanswered. When his father asked gently if he was okay, Nick laughed it off, dismissing the concern with sarcasm that barely concealed his anger. When his mother suggested rest, patience, time, Nick heard something else beneath her words, an expectation he did not know how to meet. He felt trapped between wanting to be understood and being unable to explain the chaos in his head. Every attempt to help seemed to remind him of how broken he believed himself to be. As the holidays approached, the pressure intensified. Family gatherings carried expectations of normalcy that felt impossible to fulfill. Nick tried to participate, to smile, to act like he belonged, but the effort exhausted him. His mind raced constantly, replaying old failures, imagined judgments, and fears that he was a burden no amount of love could erase. He oscillated between moments of hope and waves of despair so intense they left him numb. Each day blurred into the next, marked not by progress, but by endurance. The night of the holiday party arrived quietly, almost casually. Nick did not want to go. The house felt suffocating, the silence too loud, but the idea of staying behind alone felt worse. He followed his parents to the gathering, not truly invited but not excluded either, caught in that familiar in-between space he had occupied for most of his life. From the moment he stepped inside, the noise overwhelmed him. Laughter echoed through the rooms. Conversations overlapped. People moved with ease and familiarity. Nick felt invisible and exposed at the same time. He held a drink he barely touched, drifting from group to group, inserting himself into conversations that did not need him. His laughter sounded wrong, even to his own ears. At one point, he asked a stranger if they were famous, the question slipping out awkwardly, a desperate attempt to connect that only deepened his discomfort. Across the room, he could feel his father watching him, not with anger, but with concern. That gaze felt heavy, like a spotlight he could not escape. Nick's chest tightened. He forced a smile and insisted he was fine, but his father hesitated, unsure. That hesitation ignited something in Nick. It was not a shouting match, not a dramatic scene, just a quiet exchange that carried years of unresolved tension. When his father admitted softly that he was afraid, Nick heard confirmation of his worst belief, that he was seen not as a son, but as a potential disaster waiting to happen. The words cut deeper because they were honest. Around them, conversation slowed. People noticed the shift, the subtle fracture in the room. Nick felt exposed, humiliated, and cornered by eyes he imagined were judging him. He left soon after, slipping into the cold night without announcement. No one stopped him. The air outside felt sharp and unreal. His thoughts tangled and repeated, his father's words looping in his head until they lost meaning. Later, Nick would say it was not about that night alone. It was about years of exhaustion, fear, and confusion finally colliding. The party was simply where it became visible. He wandered aimlessly, his sense of direction dissolving into a hollow awareness of being alone. When Nick returned home later, the house was silent. That silence felt different now, heavier, as if something irreversible had already occurred. He stood in the living room surrounded by family photographs and symbols of achievement that once represented pride but now felt like accusations. His mind fractured into overlapping thoughts, each louder than the last. He felt consumed by loneliness, by the belief that he was nothing, that his existence was a mistake no one could fix. Tears came without relief. The noise inside his head intensified until it drowned out reason. Nick later described that moment as losing control over the boundary between thought and action. He did not experience it as a decision, but as a collapse. His desire to make the pain stop twisted into something unrecognizable. He moved through the house in a haze, the kitchen light too bright, the familiar objects around him distorted and unreal. When he reached his parents' bedroom, time seemed to slow. He stood in the doorway watching them sleep, overwhelmed by conflict. He whispered apologies, begged internally for understanding, for something to intervene. But the chaos inside him surged forward unchecked. What followed unfolded quickly and brutally, shattering everything that had held the family together. The sounds, the confusion, the terror became images that would later haunt him relentlessly. When it was over, the silence returned, deeper and more devastating than before. Nick collapsed, shaking, repeating apologies that could not change reality. The realization of what he had done crashed down on him with suffocating force. He fled the house, driving without destination, as if distance could undo what had already happened. In the hours that followed, guilt did not arrive as relief. It arrived as a crushing weight that made breathing difficult. Nick described feeling empty, calm on the surface, shattered underneath. When authorities later retraced the events, there were no signs of intrusion, no unanswered questions about who was responsible. The tragedy had unfolded quietly, entirely within the walls of a home that had spent years trying to save a son who could not save himself. This was the moment when a long personal struggle transformed into a public reckoning, forcing everyone watching to confront the terrifying reality of how easily unresolved pain can turn catastrophic. In the days after the killings, the house that had once been filled with cautious hope and quiet fear became a sealed crime scene, its doors closed to everyone except investigators and grief. What remained was not only the physical aftermath of violence, but a profound emotional shock that rippled outward, touching family members, friends, and an entire public struggling to understand what had happened. The tragedy no longer belonged solely to one family. It became a shared disturbance, forcing uncomfortable questions about responsibility, warning signs, and the limits of love. The first to confront the reality were those closest to Rob and Michelle. Their daughter, who discovered something was wrong when calls went unanswered, carried a burden no one should have to bear. The moment she stepped inside and realized what had occurred fractured her sense of safety forever. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing to be done. The confirmation of their deaths marked the point where private fear turned into irreversible loss. For the family, grief was immediate and overwhelming, complicated by shock and disbelief. There was no time to process, no gradual understanding, only the sudden collapse of everything familiar. As news spread, reactions varied between sorrow, disbelief, and confusion. Those who knew Rob and Michelle described them not as distant figures, but as deeply involved, loving parents who never stopped trying to help their son. Friends recalled late-night conversations filled with worry and hope, discussions about treatment options, boundaries, and the constant tension between protecting Nick and protecting themselves. This context made the tragedy even harder to comprehend. There was no narrative of neglect to cling to, no simple explanation that allowed the outside world to assign blame neatly and move on. Public attention intensified as legal proceedings began. The charges were severe, reflecting the gravity of the crime and the evidence collected. 2 counts of first-degree homicide, with special circumstances attached, placed the case among the most serious under California law. Prosecutors emphasized the nature of the wounds, the absence of forced entry, and the clear sequence of events. To them, the facts suggested intent. To the defense, the story was far more complex, rooted in years of addiction, mental instability, and emotional collapse. From the very beginning, it was clear that this would not be a straightforward trial. Nick's first court appearance drew intense scrutiny despite the controlled environment. He entered wearing protective gear, a silent acknowledgement of the risk he now represented even to himself. He did not speak beyond confirming he understood his rights. His expression remained distant, almost vacant, as if the proceedings were happening somewhere far away. Observers described the atmosphere as heavy, stripped of spectacle. There was no grandstanding, no dramatic outbursts, only the slow, procedural reading of charges that sealed his transformation from son to defendant. The legal debate that followed quickly moved beyond guilt and innocence. It centered on capacity, responsibility, and punishment. Prosecutors argued that the brutality and repetition of the act demonstrated awareness and intent. Mental health issues, they maintained, did not erase accountability. The defense countered that Nick's long history of addiction and psychological instability compromised his ability to fully understand or control his actions. They questioned whether the harshest penalties served justice or simply satisfied a desire for retribution. The possibility of life without parole or even the state's highest penalty loomed over every discussion, amplifying the emotional stakes. Outside the courtroom, public opinion fractured. Some viewed Nick as a monster who destroyed the people who loved him most. Others saw a lost soul whose life had unraveled long before that night. Online discussions grew heated, reflecting broader societal tensions around mental health, addiction, and crime. Many asked whether earlier interventions could have prevented the outcome, or whether the system had failed not only Nick, but his parents as well. The tragedy became a lens through which people examined their own fears about family, responsibility, and the limits of compassion. For those who had known the family personally, the noise of public debate felt intrusive. A private memorial was held away from cameras and speculation. Friends and relatives gathered not to discuss the crime, but to remember Rob and Michelle as individuals, as parents, partners, and friends. Stories focused on ordinary moments, shared meals, quiet kindness, and the relentless love they carried for their son despite everything. In that space, grief was allowed to exist without explanation or judgment. Nick's confession, when it finally emerged in fragments, did not bring closure. It deepened the discomfort. He did not claim innocence or attempt to justify his actions. He spoke instead of confusion, of regret that arrived too late, of a mind overwhelmed by noise and despair. His words offered insight, but no comfort. For many, they reinforced the sense that the true punishment had already begun long before any sentence would be handed down. He would live with the knowledge of what he had done, a burden no verdict could lighten. The aftermath of the tragedy extended beyond the courtroom and the headlines. It left lasting scars on everyone connected to the family and sparked difficult conversations about how society addresses addiction and mental illness within the criminal justice system. It forced a reckoning with the idea that love, even when unwavering, does not guarantee safety or salvation. As the case moved forward, the question that lingered was not only what punishment awaited Nick, but what lessons, if any, could be drawn from a story where effort, care, and hope ultimately collided with irreversible loss. Do you want me to continue with the next part of the story? As the public debate grew louder and the legal process advanced, another layer of the story remained largely unseen. The quiet moments that never made headlines, the fragments of memory that lived only with those who had shared space with the Reiner family. These were not dramatic revelations or shocking twists, but small, human details that revealed how deeply everyone involved had tried, and how painfully aware they were that something was slipping beyond their control. In these unspoken corners of the story, the tragedy feels less like a sudden rupture and more like a long, exhausted sigh that no one could stop. Friends close to the family later recalled how carefully Rob and Michelle spoke about Nick in private. They never framed him as a problem to be managed, but as a son they were afraid of losing. Conversations often ended in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because there were no answers left. They described nights when the phone rang late and everyone froze, bracing for bad news, and mornings when relief arrived simply because the sun had come up and Nick was still alive. This constant state of vigilance wore them down in ways they rarely admitted out loud. Nick, for his part, carried his own private rituals that few ever noticed. During periods of sobriety, he would wake early and sit alone, sometimes staring at nothing for long stretches, sometimes writing notes he never shared. People who lived near him during those times said he often seemed thoughtful rather than troubled, as if he were trying to assemble himself piece by piece. He avoided mirrors, avoided photographs, avoided conversations that touched too closely on the future. When asked what he wanted, his answers were vague, almost evasive. He spoke of peace rather than success, quiet rather than achievement. There were moments when hope felt real. During the period when Nick collaborated with his father on a film that confronted addiction directly, those close to the project noticed a subtle shift. Nick followed a schedule, showed up prepared, and for a while seemed grounded. Rob did not treat the collaboration as a cure. He treated it as time, something shared rather than forced. On set, they worked side by side with an understanding that did not require constant explanation. Those who observed them said the connection was fragile but sincere, built more on presence than words. Even then, the distance never fully disappeared. Nick struggled to articulate what he felt when the cameras stopped rolling. He carried guilt for every moment of progress, convinced it would not last. When praise came, he deflected it. When concern returned, he withdrew. The oscillation between hope and collapse became its own form of exhaustion. Those closest to him began to recognize the pattern long before the public did. Each recovery phase brought cautious optimism, but no one allowed themselves to believe too deeply anymore. Michelle's role in this silent struggle was often overlooked. Friends described her as the emotional anchor of the household, the one who listened without interruption, who absorbed fear and frustration quietly. She rarely spoke about her own exhaustion, choosing instead to focus on Nick's state of mind. There were evenings when she sat awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, simply listening to the house, measuring safety by sound and stillness. Her concern was constant, but it never hardened into resentment. Rob, meanwhile, wrestled with a different kind of guilt. He questioned whether his absence during key moments had created a distance he could never repair. Friends recalled him replaying conversations, wondering if different words or more time might have changed the outcome. He struggled with the balance between being a father and setting boundaries, aware that love without limits could sometimes cause harm. This internal conflict weighed heavily on him, even when he tried to project calm and structure. Nick sensed all of this, even when it was unspoken. He later admitted that the knowledge of how much his parents worried about him became unbearable. He did not see their concern as proof of love. He saw it as evidence of his failure. Each attempt to help reinforced his belief that he was broken beyond repair. In his mind, the question shifted from how to get better to whether he deserved to keep trying at all. In the days before the tragedy, there were small signs that now feel haunting in retrospect. Nick spoke less, withdrew further, and seemed strangely calm, as if he had already stepped away from the future. He avoided eye contact, avoided plans, avoided commitment. Those around him sensed the shift, but could not name it. Nothing he said suggested violence. Nothing he did triggered alarm strong enough to justify drastic action. It was the kind of subtle change that only becomes obvious after everything has already fallen apart. After the killings, these quiet memories took on unbearable weight. Friends and family replayed conversations, searching for missed signals, wondering what might have been said differently. The absence of clear warning signs made the grief more complicated, tangled with guilt and unanswered questions. There was no single moment anyone could point to and say, "This is when it all went wrong." Instead, there was a slow accumulation of strain that no one could fully see while it was happening. These unspoken stories do not excuse what Nick did. They do not soften the outcome or diminish the loss. But they reveal a truth that is often uncomfortable to face, that tragedy is sometimes built not from neglect or cruelty, but from effort that falls just short of what is needed. In the quiet spaces where love existed alongside fear and exhaustion, the limits of human endurance were tested and ultimately exceeded. And in those spaces, long before the world was watching, the ending was already taking shape, even if no one could yet see it. When the noise of the courtroom fades and the arguments are stripped down to their core, what remains of the Reiner tragedy is not a simple story of crime and punishment, but a haunting meditation on legacy, identity, and the limits of human repair. Long before the verdict that will eventually define Nick's legal future, his story had already begun shaping a different kind of legacy, one that forces an uncomfortable reflection on how society understands success, failure, and the hidden cost of expectations. Rob Reiner's public legacy was built on creativity, influence, and cultural impact, a body of work that shaped generations of audiences. Inside his own home, however, that legacy took on a different meaning. It became a shadow Nick could never fully escape. Not because his father demanded perfection, but because Nick believed he was expected to embody something he could not define. The tragedy reveals how even well-intentioned success can become a weight when it is inherited rather than chosen. For Nick, the family name was not a source of pride. It was a reminder of everything he feared he was not. Addiction, in this context, was not merely a personal failing. It was a symptom of disconnection, a way to silence the relentless internal comparison that made ordinary existence feel unbearable. The repeated cycles of recovery and relapse exposed a truth many families quietly face, that love and resources do not guarantee healing. Treatment can address behavior, but it cannot always mend identity fractures formed over decades. In Nick's case, the work of staying sober was inseparable from the unresolved question of who he was allowed to be outside of his family's shadow. The legacy of this story also challenges the idea that effort always leads to resolution. Rob and Michelle did not ignore their son's struggles. They confronted them repeatedly, openly, and at great personal cost. They sacrificed time, energy, and emotional stability in pursuit of his survival. Their love was active, persistent, and deeply human. Yet even that was not enough. This reality unsettles a cultural narrative that insists perseverance inevitably produces success. Sometimes, perseverance only delays collapse. For the public, Nick's confession reframed the tragedy in unsettling ways. It did not offer a villain to condemn or a redemptive arc to celebrate. Instead, it presented a portrait of a mind overwhelmed by noise, guilt, and exhaustion. His words suggested awareness without control, remorse without relief. This ambiguity leaves audiences uncomfortable, caught between empathy and condemnation. It forces a reckoning with the question of how responsibility is assigned when mental illness and intentional harm coexist. The legal system will ultimately define Nick's punishment, but it cannot define the meaning of what happened. That meaning exists in the questions left behind. How should society respond when someone is both deeply impaired and deeply dangerous? Where does compassion end and accountability begin? What does justice look like when no outcome can restore what was lost? These questions extend far beyond a single courtroom or family. They reflect broader tensions in how mental health is addressed within systems built primarily for judgment rather than care. The Reiner tragedy also leaves a quieter legacy, one carried by families who see their own fears reflected in this story. Parents who worry about children they cannot reach. Siblings who live alongside addiction, unsure when concern should turn into distance. Individuals who carry invisible burdens while appearing functional to the outside world. In these reflections, the story becomes less about notoriety and more about recognition. It exposes how isolation can persist even in environments filled with support. Perhaps the most painful lesson embedded in this legacy is the recognition that love, while essential, is not omnipotent. It cannot always override illness, identity fractures, or internalized shame. This does not diminish love's value. It clarifies its limits. Accepting those limits does not mean abandoning hope, but it does mean confronting reality without illusion. In the Reiner family, love was present until the very end. It simply could not reach far enough inside Nick to stop the collapse that had already begun. As this story continues to unfold through legal proceedings and public discussion, its enduring impact may lie not in the final sentence imposed, but in the questions it leaves unresolved. It challenges audiences to reconsider how success is measured, how failure is understood, and how early emotional distance can echo across a lifetime. The legacy here is not one of answers, but of awareness, a reminder that beneath public narratives and family names, there are fragile human identities struggling to survive expectations they never chose. As the story reaches its final stretch, there is no sense of closure waiting at the end, only a widening silence where certainty once seemed possible. The Reiner tragedy does not conclude with a clean lesson or a comforting resolution. It lingers instead, heavy with questions that resist simple answers, echoing long after the courtroom lights dim and public attention inevitably drifts elsewhere. What remains is not just the record of crime, but the emotional debris left behind when love, fear, and exhaustion collide beyond their limits. For those closest to Rob and Michelle, life has been permanently divided into before and after. Their absence reshapes every memory, every familiar space now marked by what will never happen again. Birthdays, holidays, and ordinary mornings carry an ache that cannot be reasoned away. The private memorial held in their honor reflected this reality. It was not about fame or legacy, but about small acts of kindness, shared routines, and the quiet devotion of two people who never stopped fighting for their child. In that space, grief existed without explanation, raw and unfiltered, because no explanation could soften the loss. Nick's future, meanwhile, unfolds under the shadow of consequences that no legal outcome can fully contain. Whatever sentence the court ultimately delivers will define his physical freedom, but cannot resolve the deeper punishment he already carries. He will live with the knowledge of what he did, with memories that do not fade and regret that offers no relief. His own words suggest that the moment he believed would end his pain only ensured it would never stop. The prison he faces is not only built of concrete and bars, but of irreversible awareness. Public discussion surrounding the case continues to oscillate between outrage and empathy. Some voices insist that accountability must be absolute, that understanding mental illness should not dilute responsibility for violence. Others argue that punishment without recognition of psychological collapse fails to address the deeper failures that led to the tragedy. This divide reflects a broader societal struggle to reconcile justice with compassion, especially when the harm done is so severe that no response feels sufficient. What makes this story endure is not its shock value, but its familiarity. Many families recognize pieces of themselves in the Reiners' experience: the sleepless nights, the careful conversations, the fear of pushing too hard or not hard enough. Many individuals see their own inner battles reflected in Nick's words, the feeling of being fundamentally out of place, of carrying an identity shaped by comparison and shame. These resonances are uncomfortable because they blur the line between normal struggle and catastrophic collapse. The tragedy forces a confrontation with a truth often avoided, that not every crisis announces itself clearly, and not every warning sign is loud enough to provoke intervention. Sometimes, danger lives in quiet patterns, in exhaustion mistaken for stability, in calm that masks despair. The Reiner story illustrates how easily long-term strain can become normalized, how hope can coexist with fear until both are worn thin. By the time collapse occurs, it can feel both sudden and inevitable. There's also a cautionary echo in how society frames success and worth. The pressure to live up to inherited expectations, to embody a name or legacy, can silently erode a person's sense of self. When identity becomes defined by comparison rather than choice, failure feels total and inescapable. Nick's story underscores how damaging that internalized pressure can be, especially when combined with addiction and untreated emotional wounds. It invites reflection on how often people measure themselves against standards they never agreed to, and how rarely that burden is acknowledged. As the legal process moves forward, the story will likely fade from headlines, replaced by the next tragedy, the next scandal. But for those who carry its weight, forgetting is not an option. The legacy of this case will live on in private reflections, in conversations about mental health and accountability, in families who approach their own struggles with renewed fear or caution. It serves as a stark reminder that love, while essential, is not a guarantee, and that early emotional fractures can echo across decades if left unresolved. In the end, the question this story leaves behind is not simply what justice should look like, but what prevention truly requires. How much attention must be paid to quiet suffering before it becomes dangerous? How families and systems can intervene without waiting for catastrophe? And whether society is willing to confront the uncomfortable reality that some tragedies are built slowly, over years, in plain sight. These questions do not end with the Reiner case. They remain open, unresolved, and deeply human, asking each person who hears the story to sit with the silence it leaves behind.